There's a specific kind of revenge that requires no plotting, no confrontation, no deliberate act of retaliation at all, one that unfolds simply as the natural, inevitable consequence of a super empath's genuine transformation after betrayal. Today, we're going to trace exactly what this silent revenge actually consists of, why it proves far more devastating than anything she could achieve through deliberate confrontation, and why understanding it matters considerably more for your own healing than for satisfying curiosity about its effect on him. Let's start with something crucial to establish before tracing this pattern in detail. This isn't revenge in the conventional sense of deliberate harm inflicted with intention. Remember everything we've traced throughout this entire series about how genuine healing transforms an empath, and understanding this distinction matters enormously for holding what follows accurately, rather than misreading it as strategy. The first silent revenge, she becomes genuinely, completely unreachable, without ever announcing this unreachability as a deliberate act. Remember what we traced extensively throughout our conversation about detachment being the only thing that actually works. A betrayed super empath, once she's completed the genuine internal work this entire series has examined, doesn't simply become harder to manipulate. She becomes genuinely inaccessible to the entire operational framework his psychology depends on, not through active resistance requiring ongoing effort, but through authentic transformation that removes the exploitable material his tactics were always designed to work with. This unreachability isn't performed for his benefit. It's simply what genuine wholeness looks like from the outside, and its silent, devastating quality lies precisely in the fact that she never needed to announce or perform it in order for it to be genuinely, completely real. The second silent revenge, her perception of him becomes permanently, unshakably accurate, and this accuracy exists whether or not she ever shares it with anyone. Remember what we discussed extensively throughout our conversation about betraying a super empath permanently. Once genuine clarity develops, it doesn't require ongoing confirmation or external validation to remain stable and complete. This means somewhere in the world, permanently and unshakably, exists someone who sees him with complete accuracy, who cannot be successfully argued out of this accurate perception through any charm, any counter-narrative, any performance he might attempt. This existing knowledge, entirely independent of whether she ever confronts him with it or shares it with anyone else, represents its own form of silent revenge, not because she's using it against him, but because its mere existence permanently undermines the narrative control his psychological stability depends on maintaining. The third silent revenge, she builds a life so genuinely complete that his continued existence becomes entirely irrelevant to it. This connects to something we've traced throughout this entire series as the ultimate goal of genuine healing. Not defeating him, but becoming so genuinely whole that his relevance to her life simply, naturally dissolves. Here's what makes this specific outcome function as devastating silent revenge, even though it was never constructed with that intention. Remember everything we discussed about his psychological structure depending on external validation for a sense of significance. A former partner whose life genuinely thrives, whose happiness genuinely doesn't require his acknowledgement or his understanding in order to feel complete, represents direct, undeniable evidence that his significance was never actually as permanent or as essential as his psychology needs to believe. Together, these three silent forms of revenge, genuine unreachability, permanent accurate perception, and complete life independent of his relevance, begin explaining why this specific kind of transformation proves so much more devastating than anything deliberate confrontation could achieve, precisely because none of it requires his participation, his awareness, or even his eventual knowledge in order to be genuinely, completely real. Let's examine these three forms of silent revenge more closely, because understanding exactly why each one produces such lasting effect requires tracing the specific mechanism through which unintentional consequence proves considerably more devastating than deliberate retaliation ever could. Here's what's worth understanding about why genuine unreachability functions as revenge without ever requiring intention behind it. Remember everything we've traced throughout this entire series about how narcissistic strategy depends on reading and responding to specific emotional signals. When someone genuinely, completely stops providing these signals, not through calculated withholding, but through authentic transformation that leaves nothing exploitable behind, his psychology doesn't simply fail to secure supply. It encounters something considerably more disorienting: the absence of any signal at all, a genuine void where his usual tools have always found something to work with before. This void, precisely because it emerges from genuine wholeness rather than deliberate strategy, cannot be successfully countered through any adjustment to his approach, because there's genuinely nothing left to adjust toward. Deliberate withholding, by contrast, always carries the possibility of eventually being worn down, outlasted, or successfully countered through sufficiently persistent effort. Genuine transformation offers no such possibility, precisely because there's no performance to eventually crack. Here's what's worth understanding about why permanent, accurate perception functions as revenge, even when it remains entirely private. Remember what we discussed extensively throughout this series about how heavily his psychological stability depends on successful narrative management across every relationship and every social context he inhabits. A single person whose perception he genuinely cannot argue against or successfully reframe represents a permanent crack in this narrative management, one that exists regardless of whether she ever confronts him with it directly. This crack matters because narcissistic identity requires something close to universal narrative success in order to feel genuinely stable, not literally convincing every single person, but maintaining enough confidence that his preferred narrative generally prevails, that occasional resistance doesn't fundamentally threaten his overall sense of self. A super empath's unshakable, accurate perception represents something different from occasional resistance. It represents complete, permanent failure of narrative management against someone whose perception was genuinely, thoroughly developed enough to see through every tactic he's ever successfully used on almost everyone else, which means this specific failure carries weight considerably beyond what any single instance of resistance would typically produce. Here's what's worth understanding about why her genuinely thriving life produces effects considerably beyond what deliberate performance of happiness ever could. Remember what we traced extensively throughout our conversation about attention versus love, about how his psychology requires continued relevance and continued significance in order to feel stable. A former partner performing happiness specifically to provoke him would still, in a strange way, confirm his continued relevance, because the performance itself would represent ongoing orientation around producing a specific effect in him. Genuine thriving, by contrast, doesn't orient around him at all, which means it produces a considerably more complete and considerably more disorienting confirmation of his irrelevance than any deliberate performance could ever achieve. He cannot successfully interpret genuine indifference as anything requiring his continued attention, because genuine indifference, unlike performed happiness, offers absolutely nothing connecting back to him at all. Here's something crucial worth understanding about why all three of these forms of silent revenge share a common thread worth naming directly. They all emerge from authentic transformation rather than deliberate strategy. And this authenticity is precisely what makes them so much more powerful than anything intentional could produce. Remember everything we've traced throughout this entire series about how narcissists remain remarkably skilled at detecting performance, at sensing the underlying need hiding beneath even sophisticated strategic calm. Silent revenge, as we've traced it throughout today's conversation, contains no underlying need to detect, precisely because it emerges from genuine wholeness rather than calculated withholding designed to produce a specific reaction. This means the most devastating thing a betrayed super empath can do, from his perspective, isn't anything she actively does at all. It's simply who she genuinely, completely becomes, entirely independent of him, entirely for her own sake, without ever requiring his awareness, his witness, or his eventual understanding in order for this transformation to be real and complete. The revenge, insofar as it functions as revenge at all, was never actually the goal. It's simply what happens, incidentally and inevitably, when genuine healing occurs against a psychological structure specifically built to depend on exactly what that healing removes. Because here's what all of this ultimately needs to lead toward, and it's worth being direct about it rather than leaving this entire conversation suspended in fascinating analysis of his experience without addressing what genuinely matters most: how to hold the concept of silent revenge in a way that actually serves your healing, rather than quietly becoming another version of the orientation around him we've cautioned against throughout dozens of previous conversations in this series. The first thing worth understanding clearly is something we need to name directly, because it addresses a real tension embedded in the very concept we've spent this entire conversation examining. Framing your own transformation as revenge, even silent, unintentional revenge, carries a specific risk worth acknowledging honestly. It can quietly keep your own healing oriented around its effect on him, even while everything about the actual mechanism we've traced today emphasizes that this effect was never the point, never something you should be actively working to produce or measuring your progress against. This is worth sitting with directly, because it represents the central tension this entire conversation has been navigating. Understanding that your genuine transformation happens to function as devastating consequence for him is genuinely, legitimately satisfying information, worth acknowledging rather than suppressing. But if this framing becomes the primary lens through which you understand your own healing, if you find yourself thinking about your continued growth primarily in terms of silent revenge rather than simply my own genuine life, you've subtly shifted your own internal orientation back toward him, even while using language that sounds like complete release rather than continued engagement. Here's the second thing worth understanding, one that offers a way to hold this tension honestly rather than pretending it doesn't exist. It's genuinely fine, genuinely human, to feel real satisfaction when you understand that your healing produces this kind of effect. Remember what we discussed extensively throughout this entire series about holding complicated, even contradictory feelings simultaneously without requiring false purity of motive. You can feel genuine satisfaction at understanding your own transformation functions as silent revenge, while also genuinely, primarily building your life for your own sake rather than his. These aren't mutually exclusive. What matters is which one actually organizes your daily choices, your daily attention, your daily sense of what you're building and why. Here's a practical way to check which one is actually true for you, connecting to something we traced extensively in an earlier conversation about the question that reveals whether genuine detachment has actually occurred. If you learned definitively that none of what we've traced today about his experience was actually happening, that he remained genuinely, completely unaffected, that no silent revenge was occurring in any form, would this knowledge change how you're living your own life? If the honest answer is no, you'd continue exactly as you are, building the same life for the same reasons, then your healing is genuinely oriented around yourself, and the silent revenge we've traced throughout this conversation exists simply as incidental, satisfying confirmation rather than as your actual motivation. If the honest answer involves any disappointment, any sense that your continued effort would feel less worthwhile without this effect occurring, that's valuable information suggesting some portion of your healing remains oriented around him rather than fully, completely belonging to yourself. Here's the third thing worth understanding. one that circles back to something we've emphasized throughout this entire series in countless different forms. The actual lasting value of everything we've traced today isn't really about him at all, despite the title's framing. It's about understanding, with genuine clarity, that authentic transformation doesn't require performance, doesn't require confrontation, doesn't require any deliberate strategy in order to be complete and powerful. This understanding matters considerably more for how you approach your own continued healing than for anything it reveals about his experience, because it confirms something worth carrying forward into every aspect of your continued life. You don't need to do anything deliberate to be powerful. You simply need to genuinely, completely become yourself, and whatever effect this produces elsewhere, in him or in anyone else whose strategies depended on you remaining exploitable, will happen entirely as natural consequence, without requiring your continued attention or continued effort directed toward producing it. Here's the fourth and final thing worth understanding, the piece that ultimately matters most as we close this entire conversation. The silent revenge we've traced throughout today's discussion was never actually something you needed to construct or achieve. It's simply what your own genuine healing naturally produces, incidentally and completely, as a byproduct of becoming exactly who you were always capable of becoming, entirely for your own sake, regardless of whether he ever experiences any of the consequences we've examined throughout this conversation, and regardless of whether you ever receive any confirmation that he has. You were never actually trying to get revenge. You were simply trying to heal. The fact that healing happens to function as the most devastating consequence available, precisely because it requires nothing from you except genuine authenticity, is simply what wholeness looks like from the perspective of something that could only ever survive by consuming exactly what you finally, completely learned you were never required to keep giving away. Never required to keep giving away. There's one more dimension worth examining here because it addresses something important about how to think about the word silent, specifically, since it carries meaning worth unpacking beyond simply unspoken or unintentional. Remember everything we've traced throughout this entire series about how sound and reaction function as currency in narcissistic relationships. The way visible distress, audible anger, even audible pleading all provide him with something to work with, something confirming his continued significance in your internal world. Silence, in the specific sense worth understanding here, isn't simply the absence of confrontation. It's the complete absence of any signal he could interpret at all, positive or negative, which represents something considerably more comprehensive than choosing not to speak. This matters because it explains why even genuine anger, expressed directly and forcefully, wouldn't actually accomplish what the silent transformation we've traced throughout this conversation accomplishes. Anger, however justified, however genuinely felt, still provides him with exactly the signal his psychology depends on: confirmation that he remains significant enough to produce this reaction, material he can work with, redirect, or eventually use to reconstruct a narrative where your anger becomes evidence of your instability rather than his wrongdoing. True silence, the kind we've examined throughout today's discussion, offers none of this. It's not anger successfully suppressed. It's the genuine, complete absence of anything requiring suppression at all, because the underlying need to produce any reaction toward him has genuinely, completely dissolved. Here's something worth understanding about why this distinction matters for anyone currently still working through genuine anger toward a narcissistic ex, because it's important not to misread today's conversation as suggesting that anger itself represents some kind of failure or incomplete healing. Remember everything we've traced throughout this entire series about grief requiring genuine space, about the importance of not bypassing difficult emotions in favor of premature performed peace. Genuine anger, fully felt and fully processed, represents an essential, healthy stage of healing from exactly the kind of harm this series has examined extensively. The silent transformation we've traced throughout today's conversation isn't meant to suggest that anger should be skipped or suppressed in favor of immediately jumping towards serene indifference. It represents instead where genuine healing eventually arrives, after the anger has been fully felt, fully expressed in whatever safe, appropriate context you've found for it, and fully integrated into your own understanding of what happened and why. This sequencing matters enormously because attempting to perform the silent, complete indifference we've traced throughout this conversation before you've genuinely processed the anger that likely, appropriately exists somewhere in your healing journey doesn't actually produce genuine silent revenge. It produces exactly the brittle, performed calm we've cautioned against throughout many previous conversations in this series, something that looks similar to genuine transformation from the outside, but that lacks the authentic foundation that makes real silent revenge so uniquely powerful and so uniquely resistant to his usual tactics. Here's a final consideration worth carrying forward from everything we've traced throughout this entire conversation, one that addresses a specific question worth asking honestly about your own current position in this journey. Are you currently in the anger stage, the grief stage, the rebuilding stage, or genuinely, completely in the place where indifference has become authentic rather than performed? There's no requirement to have arrived at the final stage in order for this conversation to have value for you. Understanding where genuine healing eventually leads doesn't mean you need to have already arrived there, and pretending you have, before the underlying work has genuinely been completed, serves you considerably less well than honestly acknowledging wherever you currently genuinely are. If you're still in the anger, allow it fully, without rushing toward the silent transformation we've traced throughout today's discussion before you're genuinely ready for it to be authentic rather than performed. If you're in the grief, allow that its own genuine space, remembering everything we've discussed throughout this entire series about how bypassed grief tends to resurface later in considerably less manageable forms. If you're genuinely already living in the place where his existence has become authentically irrelevant to your own continued flourishing, then everything we've traced throughout today's conversation simply confirms and names something you're likely already quietly experiencing without requiring you to actively cultivate or perform anything additional at all. Wherever you currently are in this journey, understand that the silent revenge we've examined throughout this entire conversation was never actually a destination to rush toward, but simply an accurate description of what eventually, naturally develops once genuine healing has had sufficient time and sufficient genuine work to fully take root. There's no failure in not yet being there. There's only the continued patient work this entire series has traced across dozens of previous conversations, work that eventually, reliably, produces exactly the genuine wholeness we've examined today, whether or not you ever specifically frame that wholeness as revenge at all.